Tasha Morgan's hands shook as she pulled the thin, yellowing envelope from the front door of her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the words. Immediate eviction. For a moment, her world froze. She knew she had paid the rent. She always did, even if it meant skipping meals so her son, Jaden, could eat. How could this be happening? In the hallway, Walter Davis stood watching, arms crossed, his sneer unmistakable. "Should have known better," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "People like you never stay long." "People like me?" Tasha's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight she knew Walter would never understand. Walter didn't even flinch. "You're out by tomorrow, or I'll have the cops escort you out myself." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. She clutched the eviction notice as tears welled up in her eyes. How could she tell Jaden they might not have a home tomorrow? What had she done to deserve this? But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Anger. A deep, simmering anger that had been bubbling for years. She had dealt with prejudice all her life, but this was the last straw. Tasha wasn't just going to let this happen. She wiped her tears, squared her shoulders, and locked eyes with Walter. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. And with that, she turned and walked inside. She had no idea how she was going to fight this. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. Tasha sat at the worn-out kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice in front of her. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. Jaden was already asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in their lives. Tasha's mind raced. How could she explain this to him in the morning? She reached for her phone, hands trembling, and dialed the number of her friend, Monica, a paralegal she had met through a community organization. Monica picked up after 2 rings, her voice full of concern the moment she heard Tasha's strained breathing. "Tasha, what's going on?" "I got an eviction notice. I don't know what to do." Tasha's voice wavered, the vulnerability creeping through her usual calm demeanor. Monica's voice softened. "Wait, what? You've never missed a payment. This doesn't make sense." "It doesn't matter to him," Tasha muttered bitterly. "You know who my landlord is, Monica. He's been looking for an excuse to get rid of me for months." Monica paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "This sounds like a violation of housing laws. There are protections, especially against discriminatory evictions." "But how do I prove it's because of my race?" Tasha asked, frustration rising. "He's smart enough not to say it outright." "You don't have to prove it alone. Get a lawyer," Monica said. "In fact, I know someone who can help. Let me make some calls." Tasha sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "I don't have money for a lawyer, Monica." "You won't need to. Trust me. There are people who will help for free in cases like this. Don't give up." After hanging up, Tasha felt a glimmer of hope, but the anxiety gnawed at her. How was she supposed to gather evidence against a man who had been careful to keep his racism masked under cold politeness? Still, she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The next day, Tasha received a call from Harold Banks, a civil rights attorney Monica had contacted. His voice was deep, authoritative, and yet kind. They met at a small coffee shop downtown where Harold spread out a few documents and legal references in front of her. "You're facing a textbook case of discriminatory eviction," Harold began, his eyes scanning over the eviction notice she had brought. "Landlords like this try to intimidate tenants, especially tenants of color, thinking they'll never fight back. But we will." Tasha nodded, but her mind was still racing. "What can I do? I mean, I'm just me." "You're stronger than you think," Harold said, offering a reassuring smile. "But I'm going to need your help. We'll need evidence. Has he said anything racist or derogatory to you in the past?" Tasha shook her head. "Nothing I can catch him on. He's careful. He makes these little comments that sting, but he's smart enough not to use racial slurs or anything obvious." "Then we'll have to catch him in the act," Harold said, leaning back in his chair. "Document everything. Record your interactions with him, if possible, and I'll file a motion to block the eviction until we can get this in front of a judge." Days turned into a week. Tasha went about her daily routine with an added layer of vigilance. Every time Walter appeared at her door with a smug grin or a not-so-subtle reminder of the looming eviction, she discreetly recorded their conversations on her phone. One afternoon, she noticed Walter talking to another tenant, a middle-aged white man who seemed uncomfortable with the conversation. Tasha pressed record and quietly approached, her heart pounding as she strained to hear the exchange. "She's been nothing but trouble," Walter muttered. "People like that, always causing problems. I should have never rented to her in the first place." Tasha's heart raced. Finally, something solid. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show his bias. She quickly sent the recording to Harold. "That's it," Harold said later that night on the phone. "It's not a smoking gun, but it's enough to back up your case. We'll move forward." That evening, as Tasha sat on the couch with Jaden playing quietly nearby, a knock echoed through the small apartment. Her heart sank as she opened the door to find Walter, a smug grin plastered on his face. "You're still here?" he sneered. "Thought you'd be packing by now." Tasha bit her tongue, her fingers tightening on the doorknob. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer soon, Walter." Walter's grin faltered for just a second, but he quickly masked it. "We'll see about that," he said, turning on his heel. As the door closed, Tasha felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her son, for every person who had ever been treated unfairly just because of the color of their skin. The fight had only just begun. Tasha could feel the weight of every interaction with Walter. Each knock at the door, every encounter in the hallway, it all felt like a new battlefront. But she stayed strong, documenting every word, every smirk, and every thinly veiled insult. Her hidden cameras, placed discreetly around her apartment, became her silent allies. It felt invasive, having to live under constant surveillance, even if it was her own, but she knew this was her only chance. Then, one morning, she struck gold. Walter was outside, talking with another tenant, a younger man who seemed unsure of his landlord's comments. Tasha, with her camera trained on the scene, overheard Walter say, "It's people like her who bring the whole place down. Can't have that kind of element here. This neighborhood's gone downhill since she moved in." Her pulse quickened. It was enough. She called Harold immediately. As the days passed, Harold prepared for the court case. The eviction had been temporarily blocked, but the real fight was about to begin. Tasha felt her nerves on edge every moment. Would the evidence be enough? Would a jury even care about the thinly veiled racism she'd endured for years? On the day of the hearing, Tasha dressed in her best clothes, her heart pounding in her chest as she entered the courtroom. Walter sat across the room, his arms folded, a smug look on his face. He clearly thought he'd already won, but Tasha wasn't about to let him intimidate her any longer. This was her moment. In the courtroom, tensions were high. Walter's lawyer tried to discredit Tasha, painting her as an overly sensitive tenant who was blowing things out of proportion. But Harold stood his ground, presenting the evidence meticulously. Tasha's heart ached as she took the stand, recounting the countless instances of bias she had faced, not just from Walter, but from a lifetime of being judged by the color of her skin. Her voice trembled at first, but soon it grew steady, fueled by a sense of justice. When the recordings were played, the courtroom grew silent. Walter's smug expression faltered as his own words echoed through the room. The weight of his prejudice was laid bare for all to see. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, Tasha held her breath. Would justice finally be served, or would the system fail her once again? The gavel struck, but the decision hung in the air. Would it be enough? The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Tasha's heart raced as she sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench. Across the room, Walter Davis leaned back in his chair, still confident that the system would protect him, as it always had. Tasha glanced at Harold, her lawyer, whose calm demeanor reassured her that they had done everything they could. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, shuffled her papers and cleared her throat. The moment of truth was upon them. In reviewing the evidence, including the audio and video recordings, as well as witness testimonies, the judge began, her voice steady but commanding. This court finds that Mr. Walter Davis has engaged in discriminatory practices and has unlawfully sought to evict Ms. Tasha Morgan based on racial prejudice. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tasha felt the weight lift from her chest. It was as though the air itself had shifted, and for the first time in months she could breathe freely. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, of triumph. The eviction notice is hereby voided, and Mr. Davis is ordered to pay Ms. Morgan for damages, including emotional distress and legal fees. The judge continued. Furthermore, Mr. Davis's discriminatory practices will be referred to the Housing Authority for further investigation. Walter's face had gone pale. His smugness evaporated in an instant, replaced by shock and disbelief. He stood abruptly, as though he could somehow reverse the ruling by sheer force of will. "This is absurd," Walter shouted. "This woman is manipulating the system. I didn't do anything wrong." The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing him. "Mr. Davis, you will remain quiet or be held in contempt of court." Tasha's heart soared as the reality of her victory began to sink in. She had done it. Against all odds, she had stood up for herself and won. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but all Tasha could hear was the steady beat of her heart and the soft, supportive whisper of Harold beside her. "You did it, Tasha. You did it." Days later, Tasha stood in front of her apartment building, the place where so much of her struggle had taken place. It no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a place where she had triumphed, where she had faced the impossible and won. Jaden played in the courtyard, blissfully unaware of the magnitude of his mother's victory. But that was how she wanted it. She had fought this battle for him, for their future. The victory wasn't just hers, though. Tasha knew that. Her case had caught the attention of local news stations, and soon tenant rights groups reached out to her. They wanted her to speak, to share her story, and to help others who were in the same situation. The transformation in her life wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about becoming a voice for the voiceless. She remembered her father's words, spoken years ago when she was just a child. "We fight not just for ourselves, Tasha, but for everyone who's been wronged." And now, she was living those words. 2 months after the court ruling, as Tasha was getting ready to attend a community meeting, she received an unexpected visitor at her door. It was Walter Davis. For a moment, she froze, unsure of what to expect. His face was different now. Not the arrogant, sneering landlord she had come to despise, but a man who looked beaten down by life. There was no fire in his eyes, just a quiet sadness. "I came to apologize," Walter said, his voice low, almost inaudible. "I lost everything because of this. My reputation, my business, everything. I never thought it would come to this." Tasha stood in the doorway, speechless. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face to tell him that he deserved everything he got. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard for justice, not revenge, paused. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "Why are you here?" Walter hesitated, looking down at his hands, which were shaking. I thought I could get away with it. I thought people like you didn't have the power to fight back. But I was wrong." Tasha stared at him, her emotions swirling. She had never expected this moment. Walter, the man who had tried to destroy her life, was now standing in front of her, broken and seeking forgiveness. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Walter continued, his voice rough with regret. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I did. And I'm sorry." Tasha didn't know what to say. The anger she had carried for so long seemed to dissolve in that moment. She realized that this wasn't about Walter anymore. It was about her. It was about the choice she had, right here, right now, to let go of the hate and move forward. She took a deep breath. "I hope you learn from this," she said quietly, "and I hope you never do to anyone else what you tried to do to me." Walter nodded, tears brimming in his eyes, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Tasha stood at the crossroads of her old life and the new one she had carved out through sheer willpower. Despite her victory in court, the reality was that this battle was just one of many. The system wasn't going to change overnight, and there were still countless families facing the same struggles she had endured. It wasn't long before Tasha found herself on the front lines again. This time, not for herself, but for others. Her case had drawn attention, and soon people from all over the city began reaching out to her for help. Tasha didn't hesitate. She couldn't turn her back on anyone who needed her support. One cold afternoon, a young mother, Keisha, knocked on Tasha's door. Keisha's face was tight with stress, her eyes red from crying. She clutched a crumpled eviction notice, the words, "Immediate eviction." Eerily familiar to Tasha. "I heard about you from some people at the community center," Keisha began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do. My landlord's trying to kick me out, just like yours did." Tasha invited her in, sitting her down at the same kitchen table where she had sat months ago, panicked and uncertain. Now, however, Tasha's role had shifted. She was the one offering hope. "Tell me everything," Tasha said, her voice calm and steady. Keisha explained how her landlord had started nitpicking about small things. Complaints about noise that didn't make sense, accusations of late payments when she knew she had paid on time. The parallels to Tasha's own experience were glaring. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Keisha admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "My son, he's only 4. I can't let us end up on the street." Tasha reached across the table, squeezing Keisha's hand. "You won't. We'll fight this together." Tasha took on Keisha's case, channeling everything she had learned from her own battle. She worked with Harold and his team to gather evidence, document interactions, and prepare for another court showdown. The stakes felt just as high as they had been in her own case, and the pressure mounted. But this time, Tasha wasn't just a victim fighting for survival. She was an advocate, standing up for someone else who desperately needed her. As the case moved forward, Tasha discovered something that sent chills down her spine. Keisha's landlord wasn't acting alone. There was a pattern. Several landlords in the neighborhood were working together, quietly targeting tenants of color and evicting them under false pretenses. It wasn't just about one person anymore. This was systemic. Tasha knew they were up against something bigger than they had initially realized. This wasn't just Keisha's fight. It was a battle for the entire community. Tasha and Harold began digging deeper, investigating records of previous evictions and complaints in the neighborhood. What they found was disturbing. An organized effort by several landlords to clean up their properties by removing tenants they considered undesirable, mainly low-income Black and brown families. They had been quietly coordinating to push out long-term tenants, making room for wealthier, often white, renters who would pay higher prices. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about exposing a network of landlords who were using legal loopholes to cover up their discriminatory practices. Keisha's case was just the tip of the iceberg. Tasha felt the weight of the discovery pressing down on her, but she refused to back down. This was bigger than anything she had ever imagined facing, but it only fueled her determination. The fight wasn't just for Keisha anymore. It was for every family who had been quietly pushed out, every person who had been wronged without the power to fight back. Harold, too, was deeply invested now. "If we can prove this is a coordinated effort, we can take them all down, but it's going to be a massive undertaking." Tasha nodded. "We have to do this. People's lives are at stake." The deeper Tasha and Harold dug, the more they uncovered. The landlords had created a network that stretched far beyond Keisha's building. They were manipulating local housing codes, exploiting loopholes, and even bribing local officials to look the other way. This was a full-blown conspiracy, and it ran deeper than anyone had expected. Tasha and Harold brought in more lawyers, expanding their team. They began interviewing former tenants, gathering testimonies from families who had been evicted under similar circumstances. Each story was heartbreaking, a reminder of the human cost behind these discriminatory practices. Just as they were preparing to bring their findings to the court, a new obstacle arose. One of the landlords in the network was revealed to be a city council member, someone with significant influence and power. This revelation changed everything. Now, they weren't just up against a group of landlords, they were up against local government corruption. The council member, Richard Hayes, was a well-known figure in the community, praised for his charity work and public service. No one would have suspected that he was involved in such a shady operation. Tasha's team was now facing a battle against someone with the means to destroy their case before it even reached the courtroom. Tasha felt the weight of the challenge ahead. Could they still win, knowing that someone with such power was working against them? Tasha and Harold had to move carefully. They couldn't afford any missteps now that they knew a powerful city council member was involved. They tightened security around their case files, made sure their communications were secure, and worked tirelessly to build an airtight case. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. One night, Tasha's apartment was broken into. She returned home to find her belongings ransacked, her files scattered across the floor. It was clear someone was trying to intimidate her into dropping the case, but instead of scaring her, it only solidified her resolve. "I won't let them win," Tasha said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "They can try to silence us, but we're not backing down." The break-in was a warning, but it wasn't enough to stop Tasha or her team. As they prepared for the courtroom showdown, they knew they were up against a formidable enemy. With city officials involved, the stakes had never been higher. If they won, it would expose not just the landlords, but the entire corrupt system that had allowed discrimination to thrive. But if they lost, it could mean losing everything. The courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, and it had become a citywide scandal. Journalists lined the walls, cameras flashing as Tasha, Harold, and their team entered the courtroom. Richard Hayes sat at the defense table, flanked by high-powered attorneys, his expression cold and unflinching. This was no longer just a tenant eviction case. It was a fight for the soul of the city. The trial was grueling, with the defense throwing every possible obstacle in their way. They tried to discredit the former tenants, accusing them of fabricating stories for financial gain. They painted Tasha and Keisha as opportunists, hoping to make a quick buck off the legal system. But Harold and his team were ready. They presented mountains of evidence: financial records, audio recordings, testimonies from former tenants, and, most damning of all, documents linking Hayes directly to the landlord's illegal activities. As the case reached its climax, Hayes took the stand. His lawyers had warned him not to, but his arrogance got the better of him. Under pressure from Harold's cross-examination, Hayes's cool demeanor began to crack. Tasha watched as the truth slowly unraveled in front of the jury. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury deliberated. Would justice be served? Or would the system once again protect those with power? The minutes felt like hours as the jury deliberated. The packed courtroom was a tense, suffocating space. Tasha sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes on the jury box. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown, each second drawing closer to the decision that would either change everything or reaffirm the corruption she had fought so hard against. Harold, ever the calm force, leaned toward her. "No matter what happens, we did everything we could." Tasha nodded, but the knot in her stomach tightened. This wasn't just about her, or even about Keisha. This was about the families they had uncovered, the countless people whose lives had been uprooted by greed and prejudice. If they won, it could set a powerful precedent. If they lost, It would only embolden the system to continue unchecked. Finally, the door to the jury room creaked open. The foreman walked slowly to the stand, the courtroom still as the judge asked the fateful question. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman cleared his throat and glanced at the piece of paper in his hand. We have, Your Honor. As the verdict was about to be read, Richard Hayes shifted in his seat. His lawyers whispered hurriedly in his ear, but the smug expression that had once graced his face was long gone. He knew, just as Tasha did, that this moment would change everything. Either way, life as they knew it would never be the same. The courtroom fell silent, every breath held as the foreman spoke. In the case of Keisha Smith versus Richard Hayes and the Landlords Association, we, the jury, find the defendants. Tasha clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. Guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. Tasha exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over. They had won. The system that had tried so hard to crush her, to crush people like her, had finally been held accountable. The fallout from the trial was immediate and explosive. News outlets were ablaze with stories of the corrupt landlords and their conspiracy to evict minority tenants. Richard Hayes, once a respected city councilman, was now facing multiple lawsuits, criminal charges, and the utter destruction of his reputation. His face was splashed across every newspaper and television screen, a symbol of greed and systemic racism. Keisha, who had fought so hard to keep her home, could barely believe the outcome. She hugged Tasha tightly outside the courthouse, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. You did this, Keisha whispered. You saved my family. Tasha smiled, but there was no joy in her eyes, only quiet determination. We did it together, she said, knowing full well that this was just one battle in a much larger war. Despite the victory, not everyone was satisfied. As Tasha and Harold walked away from the courthouse, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Malcolm Carter, a city official who had been quietly watching the trial unfold. His expression was serious, his intentions unclear. Tasha, he called out, causing her to pause and turn toward him. You've exposed a lot, but this goes deeper than you realize. Richard Hayes isn't the only one involved in this. There are more people, powerful people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. Tasha stared at him, her mind racing. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud confirmed her worst fears. The battle against the landlords had been difficult enough, but if what Malcolm said was true, she was about to enter a whole new arena of danger. Why are you telling me this? She asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Malcolm looked around, lowering his voice. Because I want to help you. But you need to be careful. The people you're going up against now, they play dirty, and they won't just target you, they'll go after everyone you care about. Tasha's heart sank. She had already faced threats, intimidation, and even violence. But this was a new level of danger. Who are they? Harold asked, his voice steady but full of concern. Malcolm glanced at Harold, then back at Tasha. People in high places, city officials, wealthy developers. They've been profiting off of evictions for years. What you uncovered was just the beginning. Tasha felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The victory in court had been monumental, but now it seemed like only a small piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. Tasha spent the next few days reeling from Malcolm's warning. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every step she took was being scrutinized by unseen forces. And yet she knew she couldn't back down. This fight wasn't just about evictions anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system built on exploitation and corruption. Harold urged caution. We need to tread carefully, he said, going over their next steps in his office. If we push too hard, we could provoke retaliation. These people aren't like the landlords we just dealt with. They have resources, connections. Tasha nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But she also knew there was no turning back. Not now. too many people were depending on her. That night, Tasha received a phone call from a blocked number. A distorted voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Drop the case," the voice growled. "Or next time, we won't just break into your house." Her hands trembled as she hung up the phone. Fear gripped her, but beneath it, there was something else. Anger. How many times had she been threatened, silenced, told to accept things as they were? She had faced this before and won, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the enemies more powerful. Tasha knew the threats were real, but she also knew that backing down wasn't an option. She sat at her kitchen table late into the night, a new plan forming in her mind. If they were going to fight this, they needed allies, people just as committed to taking down this corrupt system as they were. She picked up her phone and dialed Monica, her trusted friend from the community organization. "We need to rally the people," Tasha said, her voice steady with resolve. "This isn't just about one case, it's about the whole system." Monica agreed, but the danger was clear. As they spoke, Tasha realized that this new battle would require more than just legal action. It would require a movement. "We'll be ready," Monica said, her voice firm. "Whatever comes, we'll be ready." Tasha hung up, staring out the window into the night. The shadowy figures Malcolm had warned her about were still out there, watching. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Tasha's victory in court had inspired a wave of activism across the city. People who had been too scared to speak up now found the courage to stand against the landlords and corrupt officials who had exploited them for years. Community meetings turned into rallies, and soon Tasha found herself at the forefront of a growing movement for housing justice. Monica and Harold worked tirelessly with Tasha, organizing protests, filing lawsuits, and pushing for reforms at the local and state levels. The media picked up the story, and suddenly, Tasha was no longer just a single mother fighting for her home. She was a symbol of resistance. But as the movement grew, so did the threats. Anonymous letters arrived at her door. Strange cars followed her late at night, and one evening, as she left a community meeting, her car's tires were slashed. Tasha knew the people behind this were growing desperate. They were trying to break her spirit, to force her to back down. But what they didn't realize was that the more they pushed, the stronger she became. As she stood at the front of yet another rally, looking out over the sea of faces, people from all walks of life, all united in their fight for justice, she knew there was no going back. "This is just the beginning," Tasha said into the microphone, her voice carrying over the crowd. "They can try to scare us, but we're not going anywhere." The crowd erupted in cheers, their determination matching her own. But somewhere in the shadows, the powerful forces she was up against were watching, and they weren't finished yet. The movement grew stronger every day, and with it, Tasha's resolve. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens began to rally behind her. The corruption at the heart of the city was becoming harder to hide. Media outlets covered the protests and stories of evicted tenants, exposing the systemic exploitation that had festered for years. But with each victory, the threats escalated. Anonymous phone calls became more sinister, warning Tasha to stop before it was too late. Her closest allies began receiving similar threats. It became clear that the people at the top, the powerful developers and corrupt officials Malcolm had warned her about, were getting desperate. One night, as Tasha and Harold were preparing for another court battle to expose the network of landlords and city officials, Malcolm Carter showed up unannounced at Tasha's office. His face was tight with tension, his normally calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "We're running out of time," Malcolm said, his voice low as he sat across from Tasha and Harold. "They know what's coming, and they're preparing to fight back with everything they have. If we don't act fast, they'll bury this entire case." Tasha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "They've started destroying evidence," Malcolm explained. "Documents, financial records, anything that ties them to the evictions and illegal deals. And they're pushing to get Hayes back in power as a way to shield themselves." Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. We need a direct hit, something that exposes everything at once, so big that they can't recover. Tasha's mind raced. She had been fighting so hard to protect families from being evicted, to expose the corrupt landlords, but now it was clear this went beyond housing. This was about dismantling a system built on greed and exploitation at every level. We go public, Tasha said, her voice firm. We release everything. The documents, the testimonies, the corruption behind the scenes. We let the people see the truth. Malcolm nodded. It's risky. Once you go public, they'll come after you with everything they have. Tasha met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. Let them. We're ready. The plan was set in motion. Tasha, Harold, Malcolm, and Monica worked around the clock, gathering every piece of evidence they had on the landlords, the developers, and the corrupt officials. They compiled financial records, hidden communications, and testimonies from tenants who had been victimized. Everything was ready. The next morning, a press conference was held in the heart of the city, right in front of the courthouse where Tasha had won her initial case. The media swarmed the area, eager to hear what would be revealed. As Tasha stepped up to the microphone, flanked by her allies, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. But she was ready. My name is Tasha Morgan, she began, her voice steady and clear. And for too long, people like me, people from marginalized communities, have been forced out of their homes, silenced, and oppressed by a system built on greed and corruption. Today, we're here to expose that system. She held up a folder, filled with the evidence they had collected. This isn't just about housing. This is about the people in power who have profited from our pain. It's about the officials who turned a blind eye, the landlords who exploited us, and the developers who have destroyed our neighborhoods. Tasha's words resonated with the crowd. The media cameras zoomed in as she opened the folder and began revealing the documents. Proof of illegal evictions, secret deals, and financial corruption at the highest levels. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs as the truth was laid bare. As Tasha spoke, a group of police officers arrived, flanking the edges of the crowd. For a moment, tension rippled through the air. Had the corrupt officials sent them to shut her down? But instead of stopping the press conference, the officers stepped forward, handing over even more evidence. Internal reports that had been suppressed by city officials, showing their involvement in the scandal. The officers, led by a whistleblower who had been following the case, had joined the fight for justice. The tables had turned. With the new evidence presented, the city was forced to act. The mayor, developers, and several high-ranking officials, including Richard Hayes, were arrested, charged with a wide array of crimes ranging from conspiracy to bribery to illegal evictions. It was the largest corruption scandal the city had ever seen, and it sent shockwaves through the entire state. The landlords who had orchestrated the evictions were stripped of their properties, and their tenants were allowed to return to their homes. The city council announced sweeping reforms in housing laws, ensuring that landlords could no longer exploit loopholes to discriminate against or evict tenants unfairly. Tasha's fight had not only won her the case, it had sparked a movement that was transforming the city itself. Tasha stood outside the courthouse watching as news vans and reporters swarmed the area. Her phone buzzed with messages of gratitude from families who had been affected, from people who had been inspired by her courage. Harold came up beside her, his expression one of quiet pride. You did it. We did it, Tasha corrected, smiling. This isn't over yet, though. There's still so much to fix. There always will be, Harold replied. But today, you changed something, and that's enough for now. Weeks later, Tasha found herself back in her community, surrounded by the people she had fought for. The victory had been won, but the work was far from over. She had become a symbol of hope for so many, and now she was using that platform to push for further reforms, affordable housing, fair rent laws, and protections for tenants. Keisha, who had been by her side through it all, had regained her home and was now working with Tasha on tenant rights advocacy. Together, they formed a nonprofit organization that provided legal support to families facing eviction and discrimination. The organization, aptly named Homes for All, was growing rapidly. As Tasha walked through the neighborhood, she saw the changes. Buildings that had once been slated for luxury development were now being turned into affordable housing. The city was working to repair the damage done by years of corruption. One evening, as Tasha was preparing for a meeting at Homes for All, she received a letter in the mail. It was from a law firm representing a powerful real estate developer, a new player who had recently purchased large swaths of land on the outskirts of the city. The letter was a thinly veiled threat. "We see what you're doing," it read, "and we're watching. You've won a battle, Miss Morgan, but the war is far from over." Tasha folded the letter, her mind racing. The fight wasn't over, but she had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. She smiled to herself, the same fire burning in her chest as when she had first received her own eviction notice. "Let them come," she whispered. Months passed, and the city began to heal. The corruption that had once been hidden in the shadows was now exposed for all to see, and the reforms Tasha had fought for were taking root. The landlords who had preyed on vulnerable families were no longer in power, and the officials who had conspired to cover up their crimes were behind bars. The city council, once complicit in the exploitation of its people, was now working to create lasting change. Tasha's organization, Homes for All, grew rapidly. It became a beacon of hope for families across the city, providing legal aid, housing support, and advocacy for tenant rights. People no longer had to suffer in silence, and more families were able to stay in their homes, safe from the threat of unjust eviction. The ripple effects of Tasha's fight were felt far beyond her neighborhood. Her case inspired similar movements in other cities, where marginalized communities began to stand up and demand justice. One afternoon, as the sun set over the city, Tasha sat on the steps of her apartment building, the very place where her fight had begun. The air was calm, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. Keisha sat beside her, their children playing in the courtyard. "It feels different, doesn't it?" Keisha said, watching the kids laugh and run. Tasha nodded. "It does. The city feels lighter." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on how far they had come. It had been a hard, grueling journey, but one that had changed their lives forever. Tasha had started as a single mother, just trying to protect her home and her child. Now, she was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for those who had none. As the evening stretched on, Tasha's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Harold, congratulating her once again on the work they had done together. The courts had just upheld another victory, this time protecting tenants from unfair rent increases. It was another step in the right direction, another sign that change was real and lasting. Tasha smiled to herself, grateful for the people who had stood beside her throughout the fight. Monica, Harold, Keisha, and even Malcolm. They had all been a part of this journey, and together they had made a difference. But more than that, Tasha was proud of the person she had become. She had faced overwhelming odds, threats, and intimidation, but she had never backed down. In fighting for her own home, she had ended up fighting for the homes and dignity of countless others. As the sky darkened, Tasha rose from the steps and looked out over the city. There would always be challenges. New developers would come, new threats to fairness and justice would emerge. But Tasha knew now, without a doubt, that she had the strength to face whatever came next. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself, knowing that whatever battles lay ahead, she would meet them head-on. Tasha walked back inside, closing the door to her apartment, the home she had fought so hard to protect. The fight might never truly end, but for now, she had won. And that was enough. Tasha Morgan's story is one of resilience, courage, and transformation. What began as a personal fight to save her home became a citywide movement that dismantled corruption and brought about lasting change. Tasha's journey was not just about winning a court case. It was about standing up for what is right, no matter the odds, and ensuring that future generations would not have to face the same injustices she did. In the end, Tasha's legacy wasn't just about one victory. It was about creating a system where everyone had a chance to fight back, where no one was left voiceless or powerless in the face of greed and exploitation. Her fight became a symbol of hope, proving that with determination, even the most entrenched systems of power can be challenged and overcome. The war against injustice may never truly be over, but Tasha's story shows that one person, with enough heart and determination, can spark a change that echoes far beyond their own life. And in that change, there is hope. Tasha's story is a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right can change lives, not just your own, but the lives of others around you. Housing discrimination, corruption, and systemic injustice are challenges that many still face today. But just like Tasha, we all have the power to make a difference. If you or someone you know is facing unfair treatment, don't be afraid to speak up. Reach out to local tenant rights organizations, seek legal advice, and join forces with your community. You are not alone, and there is strength in numbers. Let Tasha's journey inspire you to take action, whether it's fighting for your own rights or supporting those in need. Every voice matters, and together, we can continue to push for justice, fairness, and equality for all. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and transformation, and join the movement for a fairer, more just world. And remember, no matter how big the challenge, you have the power to fight back and create lasting change. Share this story with others who might need to hear it, and let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.